There you go. So, see if I can get this. Right. Um, I've been I have been thinking about actually full moon energy woke me up in the middle of the night. See if I can get this right. I look like Dracula. So, it's pretty kind of cool. I gotta get close because I gotta be quiet. But the sorry, playing with the light. Just see half my face. Be like one of those mimes. So, um, one of the questions, one of the claims is that meditation is an altered state of consciousness, whereas me, people talking or thinking with language is the normal state of consciousness. And so, what Gregory Bateson did was turn this around in his book, Mind and Matter, or Mind and Nature, Unnecessary Unity. And he uses the example of men die, grass dies, men are grass. And this is what he calls this a syllogism of metaphor. And his his claim was that basically the the truth of reality is actually the syllogism of metaphor. And the reason there are unsolvable logical paradoxes in Western science, most famously Gödel's incompleteness theorem, is due to the fact that Western logic is based just on space and not time. So the time is not inherent to the logic. So I was just corresponding with somebody from India who's arguing that you can't have space unless you first have time. And the problem with this claim is that it was debunked by the Bell's inequality, which was the Nobel Prize a few years ago. And so what Gregory Bateson is arguing is actually the same as Bell's inequality, because you get into the same paradox of time when you're doing experiments around Bell's inequality. And so the non-locality is actually from the future. And for that to be true, then we have to realize that space itself is a four-dimensional illusion, and only time exists in the fifth dimension. So space-time is a byproduct of just time as non-locality. And the only scientist who has really gone into this in detail is Alan Khan, but he was working with um, another guy, a physicist. I have his book somewhere, I think, but the physicist has basically argued that time doesn't exist, and that's the exact opposite of what Steve, who's the guy? There's another. This guy, he coined the term fundamental time, and or Lee Smolin. Lee Smolin. He was a student of the same physics professor that I studied with, or I took classes from. I have his book right here. So, Time Reborn, Lee Smolin. So he's basically pointing out that in standard physics, time does not exist. And you have this, like, what they call block universe where everything is just space. Um, and so obviously, if that's wrong, then there's some serious problem in how Western science defines reality. And so if we say that only time exists, then um, what we're really saying is that all of matter is actually made of photons, and the photons then um, are based on what Roger Penrose calls asymmetric time. So why would it be asymmetric time? Because in terms of relativity, you have violation of the invariance principle in by quantum entanglement by the Bell's inequality. So the quantum non-locality is it's not just superluminal, but it violates the symmetry of space-time. And so it's another paradox to define time as asymmetric because you're defining it in relation to a spatial measurement, a wavelength. So, for example, you have color being based on wavelength of light. So, most of mainstream science argues that color is just a perceptual illusion that our brain creates. And in fact, um, light doesn't have any color inherently. But um, when you study non locality in detail based on this time non locality, Professor Yakir Aronoff argues that color is a byproduct of this singular, excuse me, like a singularity of here it is right here. Here, let's just get his quote. Color. Yeah, it's not in the index, but it's marked in here. I think it might be in the I don't see it. Bell's inequality, polarized photons. That's probably okay. Uh, there we go. Okay, I can't find it right away. But I have the quote. And essentially, okay, so it's the same paradox that oh sorry, I was looking at this book here. And it's essentially the same paradox that Basil J. Hiley realized explains the quantum potential, where you have to use Planck's constant squared, and that's like the second order term in the calculus. Um, and if you normally, the renormalization that Feynman sort of invented um, cancels out. It's the Planck's constant squared, and therefore it basically says it's negligible. By doing that, they are therefore canceling out the quantum potential. And so um, the the inherent light of wavelength is therefore this conversion of momentum and wavelength in space from this what would otherwise be time frequency uncertainty of energy of the photons. And so oops, I'm gonna lose my voice. I'm gonna get some water. So this is what's called a logarithmic singularity in normal, like commutative geometry. So like a rainbow is actually a logarithmic singularity, and it just happens when you have that a sphere, and then it like a just like how an eyeball works. You get the reflection, all the light going into the sphere then refracts and crosses over into a point as a singularity. And let's see if he has that in here. But so yeah, so anyway, you know, time reversal. But at any rate, if we what am I trying to get at here? The basically this creation of space is this is what was first discovered by Louis de Broglie in his law of phase harmony when he was critiquing relativity, and he said there inherently has to be a second time from the future. Now this whole this whole idea of a second time from the future implies that you're having a, a separation between space and time because the second time is a different observation or a different measurement. But when you do a weak measurement, you can maintain the entanglement of the photon, and by maintaining the entanglement, then you're able to then convert the energy, the frequency back into momentum as wavelength directly. And so that's why they call it modular momentum with this negative frequency and time reversed non-locality. And so you can do that in meditation directly because you're resonating the biophotons directly, and you do that when you're dreaming also. So this is my point about um, dreaming is actually a more fundamental level of reality than um, your waking state that's assuming left brain dominance with right hand technology, right hand technology, and the logical paradoxes of symmetric um, space as a mathematical measurements. So in mathematics, these are considered unsolved paradoxes of set theory, and um, in other words, it's been proven that the one-to-one correspondence between geometry as space and time as algebra and arithmetic or number just breaks down. You don't have that one-to-one correspondence, and this is what they call incommensurability in mathematics. And so Gödel's incompleteness theorem is just like, okay, well, math is either inherently inconsistent, and therefore, logically not valid, or um, it's incomplete. And of course, the Platonic ideal assumes incompleteness. Like even going back to Simon Stevin in the 1600s, his whole argument about the irrational number as a logarithm was just that it's impossible to complete the mathematics in a finite amount of time, and therefore you can just contain the math as a symmetric spatial um, logical inference, or they call this inference in mathematics. But the problem with that is when you're converting from a time process into a spatial measurement, you are covering up the fact that the time is inherently non-local and asymmetric in relation to the space. And so this idea of asymmetric time, it has to do with the fact that all of matter is light, but not just matter, but um, the center of mass inherently cannot be found for light. And this is the big point of Gerard de Hoof's paper with Martin van der Mark that they called Light is Heavy. So if you read this paper, Light is Heavy, by Gerard de Hoof and Martin Mark, they point out that in fact, and this is Louis de Broglie first discovered this with his law of phase harmony, that if you try to contain light into a box, with of mirrors, The light has gravitational mass because it has momentum, and due to relativity, the momentum is converted into space as mass. But because the light is defined by frequency, it's inherently asymmetric in relation to the time, and therefore there can never be a center of mass of the hypothetical box that contains the light. And this is why the speed of light is actually like it's a like a syllogism, or what do you call it, an axiom. It's an unproven axiom of that assumes a symmetric space-time when it's being measured. And so, science has debated the speed of light because, some people claim, well, the speed of light changes, stuff like that. But what's really going on is it's just a byproduct of relativity where you're assuming a symmetric um, spatial measurement. But then what happens is you have entropy. And so you have to assume that entropy is always increasing with any kind of external measurement. So what the quantum non-locality is pointing out is you have this negentropy or negative entropy that's based on this negative frequency from the future, and that's reverse time, and therefore virtual photons are not just an illusion. That Richard Feynman argued that they're just an illusion due to renormalization. So what he was doing is by canceling out the second order of time in the calculus, he was canceling out Planck's constant squared. And Planck's constant is just like the average energy of light. And so by doing that, he could cover up the fact that the light originates from this time and frequency, and the time and frequency are then inherently asymmetric in relation to the spatial measurement as momentum. And so it's like a really subtle, deep paradox in science that most scientists would never think about, or you know. But for Gregory Bateson, um, obviously, he was a real deep thinker because his dad coined the term genetics, and then he studied anthropology, and he was created social systems theory, and that's really what this book, Mind and Nature, is about. Is these logical paradoxes at the foundation of Western science. That the most famous one is, you know, all Cretans are a liar, or the what is it, the Cretan liars paradox. Um, not my brain's a little too tired to repeat it right now, but um, the Cretans said that all Cretans are liars. So you have this what's considered to be the definition of logic and linguistics by like Noam Chomsky, where you have I can't remember the term he uses, but recursive like different layers of phrases, but those phrases occur in time, and so therefore, if you're assuming a symmetric time in space, then you immediately have these inconsistent structures of space. And so that was Gödel's incompleteness theorem right there. And so what Eddie Oceans did was he solved what Gregory Bateson was trying to solve, because Gregory Bateson, he's like, the truth of reality is this syllogism of metaphor. You know, as I said before, men die, grass die, therefore grass are men. And so Eddie Oceans was pointing out, well, obviously, according to Western reality, mainstream reality, that would be bad logic. And he's saying that the reason this bad logic occurs is because you have this fourth factor, and the fourth factor is this canceling out of space itself as pure time. And so logically, that's defined by the imaginary number as a algebraic process. So Eddie Oceans worked with Lou Kaufman, the math professor. Lou Kaufman is still, I think he should still be around. He's sounds real strong every time you hear him. But basically, they just point out the imaginary number is actually a process in time. So you have this eternal motion of the logic. So it's like x equals -1 divided by x. And so when you have the imaginary number, normally it's assumed to be part of a complex number. Um, and then the complex number is assumed to be commutative geometry. But when you realize that, depending on whether you start with 1 or -1, then you get, it doesn't matter, you get the same result in this equation. Um, but you get this asymmetric shift that, like, I'm not going to go through the algebra, but anybody can look it up if they want to read Luke Hoffman. Um, so he calls this primordial time, and then Alon Khan calls it primitive time. And so the idea is that you have this process going on um, in reality as quantum non-locality. So it's an information that's also a force from the future because when we like if we go back to the original Pythagorean philosophy, they say one is not a number. So by that, what they mean is the one is actually the light. The light is the self. One. Oops. Let me get this. One equals light equals self. Now, what they're saying is that that's not the that's not the truth of reality because one is not a number. What you're doing is you're listening to the source of the one as logical inference. And so when you listen to the source of the one, you end up with this paradoxical process where it can either be the future or the past. So if you can see it, it's the past as light. Um, but you can also see the future as precognitive visions in meditation. But even when you're seeing the future, it's still in the past because you're not actually experiencing it externally. And so there's also a difference between your internal and external reality and then the internal observation in meditation and or perception. It could be smell or um, any kind of information as a perception. Um, but you learn that it originates from the light. And so that's where you get into this relativistic paradox in meditation based on the internal and external reality and um, the frequency of the light being asymmetric. And so for like it's pretty fascinating that like a qigong master the qigong master I studied with, he was supposed to be part of this. study at the university. This guy was going to test him like an engineer. I think his name was Robert Patterson. And so the test was going to be to heal people of a certain condition. But as part of the experiment, the Qigong master was supposed to pretend to not heal the person. Now that's a big problem when you have in science they just call this a well, it's supposed to be a randomized blind. So you have a double blind experiment. That's supposed to be the ultimate test of science. And there's a couple problems with that. Is that you're assuming randomness is the foundation of reality, and the other problem being that if you're pretending to not do something, does that mean you can actually not do it? Because to pretend something is just your intentional thinking, and intentional thinking is not the same as real information in meditation or in quantum physics, what they call proto consciousness. So then, what happens is that when you, as a healer, reality is holographic. So if you just like read somebody's energy, that means you've already taken in their energy internally, and you are forced to then heal the other person in order to heal yourself internally as a non-local spatial um, energy energy dynamic. And so that means that only the asymmetric time is real. Um, and so Qigong Master Yan Shen, he emphasized that any kind of healing, the information is bidirectional. So by bidirectional, what he meant is that the intention is based on the spatial momentum that's would be defined as a symmetric logic in space, and therefore bidirectional. But this spatial logic is actually healed in a asymmetric time process. And so Yan Shen, Qigong Master Yan Shen, he warned one of his friends. One of his friends was staying with Yan Shen, and he warned him that he would get sick. His friend would get sick because his friend would pick up the illnesses that Yan Shen was healing of other people. And so what that means is that even though you can have the intention of healing somebody, there's still this process of the energy that takes a certain amount of time to, like a delayed reaction, essentially. And in terms of spatial measurement. So even though the bidirectional is defined by the wavelength, like you would reverse the wavelength as intention in space based on the color. So this gets back to the color again. But the actual time and frequency is based on this subconscious and superconsciousness difference. So in the superconsciousness, you can have a precognitive vision that's more real than being awake. But then um, in the subconscious, you would have an experience that you're not aware of yet, but you become aware of it later while you're dreaming. So then you wake up from your dreams, and if you take a moment when you wake up from your dream, you should be able to figure out why you had the dream that you had based on your subconscious perceptions when you were awake the previous day. So you can be like, usually your dream will be something really bizarre, right? But then you can be like, oh, well, I thought of this during the day, and what I thought of had a certain emotional um, resonance or impact in my subconscious, and therefore it came up in my dream, and my brain then just like associated it with some other subconscious um, emotional impact that I had thought about during the day or perceived and noticed. And just these thoughts are just like flashes of light while you're awake. And you don't realize that every time you take a photo, it has to be processed chemically in your body. That's the Jing energy, the electrochemical energy. So when you meditate, it's like you're processing that consciously um, before it's processed subconsciously. And if you don't meditate, then these subconscious emotional processes, impacts become blocked in the body, and they don't get processed properly. When you process them properly in the meditation, then you're converting that spatial experience back into pure time, and that's what they call the emptiness. So the emptiness is not just what you can't perceive, but it's also this healing harmonization process of the future overlapping with the past and therefore like canceling it out. And And so when you do a healing of somebody like the energy master, he was supposed to not heal people, but just by perceiving the person, he immediately would take in their energy blockage, and so he was forced to heal them just simply by perceiving who they are, and therefore the healing had to take place. Now, what's fascinating about this is that Qigong master F.E.P. Chow said that people would often get healed before they came to her clinic to get the healing physically in space. So they're getting healed from the future. Um, so if you think about it, it's like, well, this is something that always really puzzled me because it's like, all right, but it makes sense if you realize that time is inherently precognitive, but then we're converting it to a spatial experience through the color of light. And so that's the emphasis of this book here, is that that the color of light is inherent to reality, and that logarithmic singularity, the conversion of time frequency uncertainty or into a spatial momentum measurement. And so when we rely on listening as meditation, as logical inference, then we're able to directly work with the light as biophotons that we meditate with. And so there's no kind of need to rely on a symmetric, um, like, external observation. Of course, there's a need to do this in terms of civilization, and that's where the problem arises because our civilization is defined by this symmetric spatial measurement for technology and logic, and so you know That's why these qigong masters, there's a lot of bizarre stories about them because, like, they don't don't quite fit into the Western Western reality of, like, the symmetric space-time and stuff. And, of course, that's also why we have the, ecological crisis that's being denied. It has to be denied because it goes against this symmetric, definition of space-time, and that was Gregory Bateson's big point. It's just like, well, there has to be a necessary unity between mind and nature, and when you have that unity, it's based on this subconscious process. And so Eddie Oceans was just saying that, you have to have a negation in your conscious process, and that negation is the logical inference, um, as the emptiness. And so that's the quantum, um, what they call quantum logic. When they say quantum logic, that's what they mean, is this negation process and through silence. And so what, the most famous term that Gregory Bateson coined was the double bind. And so in science, you have the double blind experiment. And so then in when you take this asymmetric time, you end up with a double bind as a logical inconsistency. And that's often used against people in social settings to, put them in um, a bind, literally, and based on the bad intention of this lower frequency. Um, and so Gregory Bateson's argument was this is actually what gets then labeled as, like, schizophrenia in by society, because they target somebody with these double, binds that the person cannot figure out how to escape. And so then the person gets, labeled. And this was Eddie Ocean's point, was that if you could figure out this quantum logic, you can figure out that the only solution to these paradoxes of logic are as syllogisms of metaphor is actually through this time frequency, non-commutativity. And so what that means is the non-locality is goes on in silence because it can only be accessed through silence as meditation and logical inference. And then when you meditate, you can start having precognitive, uh, information signals that then enable you to, by short circuit the otherwise, subconscious influences that would occur in real time while you're, with your eyes awake walking around. um, if you're able to know something is going to happen in the future, then you're able to, like, short circuit it, and subvert it in the real time. And this is what I call a glitch in the matrix, because often, like, if you read, Christina Donnell's book, uh, Transcendent Dreaming. Christina Donnell. She says how, or she says this in her interviews. She gets interviewed about her book, and she says, I wouldn't change the future. I wouldn't try to change it." Um, so, and somebody gets mad about this. They're like, well, what if it would, heal somebody or prevent something really bad from happening? And so the the point of, yeah, or my, Chun Lin, he's like, well, I think he said, like, I think he said 70% of our waking reality is fate. And so you can change fate, but it's hard to change it. Now, how you define fate would be, um in terms of what I'm talking about, it's actually just your subconscious. If you're controlled by your subconscious, then that's fate because your past is controlling your future. Whereas in meditation, your future is controlling your past. And that's the big difference is that if you go into deep into meditation, then you can have precognitive visions. And so it's not that you can necessarily change your future, but it's that when the future happens, you can suddenly, in real time, understand the subconscious influence that caused that present moment from the future. In other words, you can understand how the future caused the past instead of vice versa. And so it sounds like a really bizarre, paradox. But when you realize that all matter is made of photons, and that time is actually non-local, and so they've proven in these quantum of entangled photon experiments that they call weak measurements that the future is actually changing the past. And so um, the whole point of meditation is that it's based on time and not space. And since our civilization is the exact opposite, based on spatial energy and not time, then society considers meditation to be the ultimate waste of time, you know, because you're just sitting there with your eyes closed and, trying to figure out what's going on or whatever. and, and then that's what they call religion, right? I mean, like even now they don't have strict religion, like the man who could fly, this human levitation is back when they took religion really seriously, and you could be a monk and you could be fanatical about it and really pray all the time with your eyes closed. And so you were essentially, it was the same as Eastern meditation. And so then you start tapping into this energy that people don't know it exists. And so, um, let's see. Yeah, that's pretty much all I wanted to say is that Gregory Bateson, he was really struggling in his book, Mind and Nature, A Necessary Unity, because he's like, there's a serious problem in Western science, and it creates double binds in logic. And this leads to people being, considered to have some kind of brain disease, but he's saying actually it's a byproduct of their social environment and the dynamics going on as anthropology. And he's saying that if you can constantly, he called it I think he called it like creativity of three, learning three. He called it learning three. And he says like dolphins will figure this out where they will learn to learn. And you'll see this sometimes in um like, like the school I went to at Hampshire College, that was their model. That was their you where you learn how to learn. And you find, sometimes that phrase is repeated when you if you go to a school that's really independent and whatever. And so this whole point of like learning how to learn is that everything is constantly new all the time. It's just eternally changing all the time. And this really can this can scare people because it's not just that you're not able to replicate things, and Western science assumes that you can commodify and replicate. That's the definition of truth. Seeing is believing, and so you should be able to repeat something identically in order to prove that it's true. But this inherently is the exact opposite. It can never be, direct, like identically repeated. And so there's also an inherent aliveness to reality or freshness and this is what Yogananda said. He said everything is ever fresh and ever new. And in Kriya Yoga, and so that's really what Roger Penrose is pointing out too. He's saying like, AI cannot ever exist as a inherent aliveness in terms of it being an external creation of science. Um, that there's this deeper aliveness that's like behind the logic of science, as Gödel's incompleteness theorem. And so the problem is that you have this accelerating ecological crisis, and this is what Gregory Bateson was aware of this, and that's why he's like, we need an ecological movement that reverses um, the paradoxes that are otherwise inherent to Western science. And Roger Penrose, he realizes this also because he's like, well, I don't think we'll survive the global warming um, crisis. And he mentioned this once because he's a physicist or a mathematical physicist, and so he can just focus his whole life in this abstract reality of black holes and stuff like that, what the end of the universe and whatever. And then he can just like mention in passing, oh, by the way, I don't think we're gonna survive, abrupt global warming. And so, um, hey, how's it going? One synchronous. Yeah, right. The Yeah, so Eddie Ocean's whole point is that you can do this mind body integration as the solution to the double bind, and what he wanted to do was actually study the brain with MRIs showing that this non-commutativity exists in the neurons, and that's literally what Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff have been doing, and they call it super radiance of the microtubules. And so yeah, the whole concept of non-dualism is not acceptable in the West because we have to have the ego. You have to succeed as a person. You have to leave the nest. You have to, not live with your parents and go out and be a rugged individual and stuff like that. And so, in terms of ecology, you realize that everything's interwoven and it's based on symbiosis and cooperation. And so what we perceive as competitive and dangerous is actually a subset of this larger mutualistic interdependence. And that was like Kropotkin's emphasis, in anarchism, that Peter Kropotkin or whatever his name was. But yeah, so the double bind, it only exists in as defined by words. But when you rely on music, then you can. This is why religion, like the paradox of music and religion, is really fascinating. Because when you get like a really patriarchal extreme of religion, then they ban music. They're totally against music. But usually, religion, relies on music as the most important means of bonding people, or else it could be music or it could be silence, like mysticism. So like the Quakers or the um I don't know, there's all these like Christian mystic subsets that might rely on silence instead of or music, and so or the other thing, obviously, Gregory Bateson emphasizes is humor, jokes, because whenever you have a joke, it's bypassing, it's short circuiting these logical paradoxes, and that's exactly what makes it funny. And So yeah, the obviously, if you have a society that tries to take um, logic totally, like this was Slavoj Žižek's point about communism. It's like, okay, communism is trying to be super rational, and when you try to be super rational, then you're creating these paradoxes. And so Zizek was saying the best way to undermine communism is just to follow the rules. You know, if you follow the rules to the extreme, and in the West they call this slowdown. You know, by union, a union can cause a factory slowdown just by following the rules. You know, very strictly, and just be like, well, that's what you told me to do. And so the idea is that a democracy is actually more efficient than a autocratic regime, because when an autocratic regime tries to just create these patriarchal rules and be like, we have to do, you know, what I say, then then it immediately like gets undermined, because if you try to follow what they say exactly, then it's gonna just get messed up. And um so when you have real democracy, you're forced to have a dynamic based on this subconscious or super consciousness awareness that has to be like, you know, based on respect and love and all that, and not just on taking everything literally, you know, at the word or whatever. You have the meaning bypasses what the person says. So if somebody's like wants to be in charge, if they're not articulate, and then it's gonna immediately create problems. And so I find this pretty funny, because any kind of relationship where somebody tries to be authoritarian, they're gonna like mess it up pretty fast. Yeah. Okay. I don't know Scott Preston, but yeah, the term was created by Gregory Bateson, double bind. And so that's like the one term. It's just like his dad coined the term genetics. Yeah. Yeah, and that's of course what they want to do now, is just like round everybody up and put them in institutions or whatever. And so um you know, you find this in every, like in China. In China, the like John Peng, when he trained with the Qigong master was working in a like a boiler room in a factory. That was his job, I think, was like shoveling the coal into the furnace or something like that. But he was secretly a spiritual master of Shaolin. But he had to hide because they attacked, you know, Shaolin. It's like the classic, we have to get rid of the anybody who might threaten our power or whatever. And so anytime you have any kind of independent people, like homeless people are independent. They ironically, if you're just doing your own thing, like, you know, if you want to live in a house, you have all these regulations. Obviously, you know, you have ordinances and permits, and you got to file it. You have to file a permit, and they will micromanage your life to a T, and then you pretend you're independent. Like, you go around and be like, "Oh, I'm independent," and you can be fairly independent, but you know, you're gonna have like what happens to, like, in terms of ecology, how you relate to ecology. You're probably gonna, you know, it's gonna be very difficult to um have an alternative lifestyle, so to speak, in relation to ecology. And because the first thing you have to do, first of all, is like get a septic permit. a subsurface sewage permit. Well, that's assuming you're going to have your sewage subsurface, which you're it's like there's all sorts of like you immediately get into. That's the obviously that's the first problem is like, what do you do with somebody's waste if they're homeless? And so they think, well, we'll just put everybody in the institutions and um without realizing that civilization as a whole is just like collapsing because it's going to be too hot to grow food. I mean, there's these larger problems that obviously are structural, and this is the point of um, Noam Chomsky, is that unless you look at these structural institutional problems, then you're not going to be able to solve the what's going on in society. And that's why China is was so rapidly advanced because they did everything as a structural top down kind of thing, and that was the argument for fascism too. So it's like there's has to be a constant. I think he called it heterarchy. That was another term that I think might have been coined by Gregory Bateson, if I remember correctly. Is he wanted to combine hierarchy, so he called it heterarchy. So instead of just hierarchy, you have this like in systems theory, you have to have feedbacks, and that's essentially what AI. Why people are arguing that AI is going to solve everything because you have these. It works through a what do you call those feedback systems? It's a term for the whole thing. I can't remember, but it's like reinforced. The algorithms have to reinforce each other, and of course the problem is that that process of information requires so much energy to process. So now we're converting to an extremely highly energy intensive information processing system that has to dissipate the heat, with water. So it's kind of fascinating what the AI trajectory of computer science and stuff is actually just like accelerating the collapse of civilization through the ecological crisis. But people have to claim the exact opposite. They have to claim, "Oh, it's going to solve everything." Yeah, I mean, exactly. Well, that's I've been trying to find a way around that, and um, the I mean, there's like again, there's technical loopholes. Like for example, if you have any kind of like toilet waste treatment device, um, then you need a permit. And so, but it says if it's in a structure. So if it's in a shelter, that means you're camping. Okay, so you don't need a permit if it's in a shelter, a toilet like any kind of toilet waste treatment device. Um, so now you're camping. So then, if you're camping, then it would be considered seasonal recreational land. But once it's assessed as seasonal recreational, then you're required to have a permanent facility somewhere else, a permanent residence, which means facilities. It's on some other land. So you can only own recreational seasonal land as your secondary property. So then you're like, okay, if you have it as a farm, so this is what people do is they have it as a farm, and then um they like in Vermont, yeah, the farmers were doing ecological sanitation, John Jenkins composting, and they got fined. So now Vermont is trying to pass a state law allowing ecological sanitation or human or composting on their land. So as it stands right now, you can have a composting toilet, but they're still assuming that the compost will be taken off site and like processed normal sanitation. So they're completely like denying the whole definition of a composting toilet, you know. They're like, "Oh yeah, you can pretend to compost for fun, you know, because you as a recreation." It's kind of really fascinating when you like dig really deep into the rules. Like they'll call it a composting toilet, but they don't really mean it's compost. So then technically, go into if you use a container as some kind of toilet waste treatment device, if you do not remove anything from it, according to the EPA, it's septage for only a year. And after a year, if it's not removed, it's no longer septage. So technically, you could have containers that you're, composting, and this is what the yeah, the permaculture scene is they're creating a documentary about this. I'm on the permaculture forum. They're called Permies. I recommend signing up to Permies, but they've been really promoting this concept they call the willow feeder, and it's on YouTube a bit. But they're trying to make it into a movie, and they're trying to get paid. The guy who thought of the concept, he immediately wants money for it. That's the whole problem is that whenever, but essentially the whole idea is like he's using 45-gallon waste containers, and then you do dry composting, so you're diverting. So there's no sewage, there's no, black water because it's dry. And then you cover it up. You put a cover over the container. You never remove, there's no discharge. And I talked to the pollution control agency. And I said, "Do I need a permit?" He says, "Well, is there any discharge?" And I said, "No." He said, "Well, then you don't need a permit." So again, if you do not remove anything, so there's no discharge, and you leave it in the container for over a year, then you can compost it on your land, technically, because it's no longer septage. If it's not septage, and that's what they do, is they leave it in the container for 2 years, and they're saying, like, this is better than the John Jenkins method because you're not moving anything around, you're not removing anything, you're just going into the container and you're covering it up. Um, but you wanna compost it, obviously. You wanna put, like, carbon over the so you have a, like, 20-to-1 ratio. So that would be the plan, what to do, but obviously, that's assuming that the government understands what composting is. Because if they don't understand, the problem is if you have any container over 5 gallons, then it gets permitted as a septic, container of wastewater. So that's the other thing is that you have to make sure it's a dry container and you're doing urine, diversion, what they call a UDDT, a urine diverted dry toilet. So that's my little compost speech. Okay, I'm gonna sign out, and I think that that would enable me to legally, be legal and bypass the laws, but being legal is different than being accepted socially, Like, look at what happened to the Native Americans, right? Like, they're not sovereign because they didn't improve their land with, symmetric technology. And because they're not sovereign, they just occupy their land, and because they occupied it, they can be made to unoccupy their land legally. You can conquer them, and um, so it's just straight up just genocide covered up with legalese. And then they say, well, now they're dependent on us, and they are just no, they were never sovereign. They're just children of the state or whatever, and they're also they're illogical because they think like children or whatever and stuff like that. And then, so it's the same kind of problem. And you're doing that to whole cultures that have been living here for thousands of years. And then we come along and create a ecological crisis in a couple hundred years. So yeah, it's like so So some people are like, well, civilization is insane. So then most people just play along with it and pretend that they're sane, and it's a fun topic, right? And of course, they push the big pharma drugs, so everybody's got to be on drugs or whatever. And if you're not on drugs, then you're insane, essentially. That includes coffee and salt and all that. And anyway, um, I got a response from the person in India. Yeah, they just said their knowledge is not deep enough. I'm gonna quote this. Anyway, so thanks for letting me blab. But I think I articulated what I was trying to get across. Yeah. Yeah, you know what? You know what's a really great book is The Book of Woe by Gary Greenberg. I highly recommend that book because it's really fun to read. I'm not done with it yet, but when you're it's super enjoyable because he's getting an insider's view of the creation of the DSM, and he's critiquing it from the inside. It's super funny. It's like he's just tearing it apart, the whole process. He's basically just exposing the APA as just a total scam racket. And I mean, obviously, people need help. And if they can't figure out how to behave properly, but Gregory Bateson's whole point is that most people who can't behave properly are being forced into that situation through these subconscious, tactics of control. Yep. So, the qigong, you're working with the energy level directly, and you're literally doing exorcisms. Like qigong master Chen Yulin, he's like, "No, I'm gonna do an exorcism of you, I'm gonna be doing exorcisms." And anyway, let it go. I can give some exorcism stories if I wanted to, but they're that whole thing is real, where people just start screaming and stuff, and it's a real exorcism. So, all right, happy full moon.